Welcome folks to our webinar today, the long arc of building power, election debrief with New Mexico Women of Color. I see folks starting to come into the room, and if you would not mind dropping in your name, your organization, and where you're joining us from today, we'd love to see who is here with us. Welcome, folks. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. Thank you for joining us on this Friday, this Veterans Day. We appreciate it. So it looks like there might be, the chat is disabled. Jasmine, if you could take a look at that so folks can chat into our webinar. Thank you, folks, for your patience. I know we've got a good group of folks in the house right now. I see a good chunk, and I'd love to know who's in the room. So as we're waiting for the chat function to come up and get our PowerPoint going, I'm going to go ahead and just start moving us forward, because we've got an hour today, which is not a lot of time. I have 4 incredible guests in the room with us that are going to share what the outcome of Tuesday's election means for New Mexico, as well as the long-term work they've been doing in New Mexico. And so, again, this is a webinar. Our guests today are Laurie, Weahkee, Adriann, Barboa, Oriana, Sandoval, and Andrea, Serrano. So thank you for saying yes, for being here today. I was mentioning earlier when we were talking that these 4 women to me represent the heart and soul of New Mexico. I've had the privilege and honor of knowing and working with them for nearly 20 years, almost all of them. And so I'm just really grateful for the work that you all do for New Mexico and New Mexico families. So thanks for joining me. A couple of housekeeping things. So for those of you that are on the webinar as attendees, we won't be able to see you. You'll be able to see the hosts and our panelists today. And if you want to tweet out about this webinar, you can put Building Power NM, hashtag Building Power NM. And that'll get some buzz going around our webinar. Jasmine, I also want to take a quick minute to introduce Jasmine Leeward, who is our BMP admin and support tech for today. So thank you for being here with us today. Really appreciate that. Jasmine, if you want to advance to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so as I was mentioning, if you want to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, feel free to use that. I'm hoping that it's up. We're still trying to fix the chat issue as to why folks aren't able to drop in the chat. So hopefully we can get that figured out really soon. This webinar is being recorded. We'll share the link along with additional materials afterwards. And as I mentioned earlier, if you would like to tweet Building Power NM at Building Movement, we would appreciate it. Okay, moving on, I wanted to share just a little bit about Building Movement Project and the work that we do. If you want to advance our slide, Jasmine. So Building Movement Project is a national organization. We develop research tools, training, and opportunities for partnership to both nonprofit organizations and the sector to support voice and power to the people that they serve. Since its founding over 20 years ago, BMP has focused on three main areas: movement building, leadership, and service and social change. For the movement building and transformational solidarity work, we help organizations and movements work collectively to build a bigger impact than they might. And towards the end of the webinar, we're going to share out some resources and some upcoming webinars in addition to our Race to Lead survey, which is still live in the field, and we hope that folks will be able to participate. Yay, I see some chats coming in. It is up. Okay, Cecile Lipworth from Santa Fe. Thank you, Flora Lucero. Okay, folks, please start dropping in your name, your organization, where you're calling in from. We'd love to see who's in the house, and thank you for your patience with us. So that's a little bit about Building Movement Project. I want to share the amazing folks that we've got with us today on our webinar. And so before we do that, the goals today, we want to analyze where New Mexico stands post-election, learn about the successes and challenges of long-term power building in New Mexico, and looking ahead, preparing for 2023 and beyond. Okay, I'm starting to see our chat light up here. So thank you folks for sharing where you're coming in from. Really great to see you. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. We have with us Laurie Weahkee, who is a consultant and was formerly the executive director of the Native American Voters Alliance and New Mexico Native Vote. Laurie has led numerous issue and electoral campaigns in Native American communities for over 25 years. She received a Cultural Preservation Award from the New Mexico Department of Indian Affairs for her work to protect Native American sacred sites. Ms. Weahkee served on the All Pueblo Council of Governors Legislative Committee, the New Mexico Governor Lujan Grisham's statewide Complete Count Committee, and the New Mexico Secretary of State's Native American Task Force. Laurie is Dene, Cochiti, and Zuni Pueblo and has one son. Welcome, Laurie. Our next panelist is Adriann Barboa. She is a county commissioner for District 3 here in Bernalillo County and the policy director for Forward Together, which is a policy and culture shift organization. Commissioner Adriann Barboa is a generational New Mexican who has spent much of her life in Bernalillo County. Her commitment to just and equitable policies and programs has continued throughout her lifetime, from starting a nationally recognized mentoring program for students of color, to passing legislation to support pregnant and parenting young folks, from leading campaigns for women and families to access the full spectrum of reproductive health, to mobilizing community voices for quality, affordable health care for all. Thank you for joining us today, Commissioner Barboa. Next up, we have Oriana Sandoval. She's the CEO of the Center for Civic Policy and the co-director of the New Mexico Civic Engagement Table. CCP is a nonprofit organization based out of Albuquerque and strives to involve everyday New Mexican in the public policy decisions that affect their lives, civic engagement, legislative advocacy, and voter mobilization campaigns. Oriana receives her BA from Occidental College and is an MPP and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley. Oriana has worked on environmental justice and civil rights issues for more than a decade and served as the founding ED of New Mexico Vote Matters, a nonprofit organization committed to empowering the disenfranchised communities. She lives here in Albuquerque with her husband and her son and daughter. Thank you, Oriana, for taking time today. And last but not least, we have Andrea Serrano, who is the Executive Director of OLE and the co-chair of the Working Families Party National Committee. Andrea Serrano is a Chicana who was born and raised in the neighborhood of Lueras in Albuquerque and has been working in nonprofit and social justice organizations since 1999. Andrea's experience spans decades, beginning with her work at the Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico, where she was a community educator focused not only on violence prevention, but also interrupting and addressing rape culture, particularly with young people and college students. Andrea began working at OLE in 2012 as the community organizer, focused on BIPOC communities and urban conservation. She's now the executive director of the organization. She's also a published poet and an opinion writer, and she lives in the South Valley with her compañero, a slew of animals and plants. So thank you to these four incredible leaders in our community for joining us today. And before we get into our conversation, we wanted to run a quick poll to get a sense of how you all cast your vote in Tuesday's election. And so I believe that we've got a poll that we can share with you all to take here in a second. And welcome Robert Lopez, Henry Rayal, Loretta Trujillo, Daniel Griego. Okay, we've got a poll going up now. How did you vote in Tuesday's election? Did you vote in person, by mail or absentee, or early voting? Okay, looks like we've got just a few more seconds on the poll. So if you haven't responded to the poll yet, you've got a few more seconds to do that. But it looks like there's a very close tie by in-person at 44% and early voting at 51%, a much lower mail and absentee voter turnout. So thank you for sharing that. And it's good to know that the early vote has made a difference in these elections. So let's go ahead and dig into our conversation today. We do know that New Mexico stayed a solidly blue state. We had some big moments. There were some big wins, particularly looking at the constitutional amendment and folks that worked on that. I know that those of you here today were engaged at different levels on civic engagement projects and voter turnout. And so I wanted to start by asking Adriann, if you could share a little bit about what the results of Tuesday's election tell us about New Mexico.
Well, and I'm so honored to be on this panel, and shouts out to all my Strong Families Board Together folks who were on, but also shouts out to all the folks, and includes all of us. I've been honored to be able to lead in a lot of ways the fight for full reproductive health access, including abortion access. And so many, I would probably say 90% of the folks on this call have put in work to make sure. And for me, it being center stage in our communities, the election that just passed like reaffirms again that New Mexico is solid about supporting access to abortion care, access to all the needs of our reproductive lives, and that we also are here for healthcare and including healthcare for immigrants. So I feel like that is, for me, the election reaffirms that solidly. So everybody knows, don't mess with us. I'll keep it short and sweet.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. So Andrea, I wanted to ask, is your response to what Adriann just shared? And then if you could also share with us what you think were the big moments leading up to the election, and, how did you all build leading up to Tuesday?
I just have a lot of gratitude in my heart for people who turned out to vote when there was all of this just punditry, just, going on and on about, what to expect on Tuesday and what the outcomes were going to be. And, pundits read polls and organizers talk to voters. And so I think what Adriann said is spot on. But I think the buildup to this, is you can't just engage folks like 3 weeks before Election Day and remind them to go vote. We're talking about years-long building in New Mexico, and really building with communities who aren't your sort of typical voter. There's that piece as well, that New Mexico is 63% people of color, and yet, historically have made up, between 36 and 38% of the electorate in statewide elections. So we're not being represented in elections. And if we sort of just went about it business as usual, 50+1, the win is all that matters, then we wouldn't be hearing from our communities. And so it isn't just the win, but it's how you win and with whom. And I think that's what's been really important, is that we're seeing more engagement, we're seeing more youth engagement, we're seeing, the work that's been laid out by Laurie and by NM Native Vote, of really highlighting how difficult it is to vote on tribal lands, and how difficult it is to vote for people who live in rural areas, but also how voters of color are disenfranchised in lots of different ways. And so there's all of these things you keep in mind as you're really thinking about, who do we want to talk to? Who are the voters we want to be talking to? And voters are smart. If you're just showing up 3 weeks before the election and saying, hey, your civic duty, get out there and vote, none of us responds well to something like that. It really is about on the off cycle, and you're still talking to folks and asking them what matters to you, what's important to you. And I think that voters really showed, with the outcome of the election on Tuesday, voters really showed up and elected and re-elected the folks who have shown up for them. We've in New Mexico, we have expanded Medicaid, we have passed paid sick leave, we've increased the minimum wage. Early education is now a constitutional right. But before that, there was the creation of the Early Education and Care Department, Early Childhood Education Care Department. So there's all of these wins, and the fact that we keep sort of saying like, oh, New Mexico is this terrible place. It isn't this. We have free college in New Mexico, the only state that has that. And so, I think that that's the buildup that got us to Tuesday. And that's the buildup that got us to the outcomes. They weren't a fluke. It wasn't, it was great to see all of the pundits on Wednesday scrambling to, make excuses for why they were so wrong. But, organizers know, and we do so with strength and confidence.
Thank you for that, Andrea, and for sharing, I think, that perspective. I think it's important to understand that, as you mentioned, this work doesn't happen overnight. It isn't just 3 weeks, until election, but that there's work that has been going on for decades in community. and you four represent that to me. And I wanted to ask Oriana if you could share a little bit about the constitutional amendment. I know that you all worked on that, and give us some insights into what it took to build that in order to get, I think it was a 70% yes vote. So that shows a huge support for something like early childhood education. So if you could just share a little bit about that and any reactions you have to what Adriann and Andrea have shared so far.
Yes, thanks, Alicia. Obviously, that was a huge win. That was literally a decade in the making on election day. Like Andrea mentioned, we now do have a constitutional right to early childhood education in New Mexico, which is amazing and really puts us at the forefront of the country. I'm not sure any other state actually enshrines that right in our Constitution. So that's huge. And it was a huge undertaking. I mean, shout out to everyone here and the participants. This was a statewide community-led effort. You know, it started a decade ago with an idea, and of course, like, it was way too radical, right, for the New Mexico legislators, but community kept coming back, literally community. It was like toddlers and kindergartners showing up to the roundhouse year after year saying like, no, this is our vision and this is what we want. And this is how we envision transformative change for New Mexico and for our families. So it was a wild ride, you know, showing up, getting shut down in the roundhouse, not even being able to get a hearing, culminating into, you know, we use all of the tools at our disposal. So on the C3 side, the civic engagement and issue education and lobbying, and also on the C4 side, the accountability through elections, right? And that happened in a big way. Was it only 2020 that we unseated like a third of the Senate? But yeah, they had to go. And again, this isn't about blue or red. We unseated Democrats, right? To be able to open up the discourse for a true legislative discussion. And we see the results. We saw the results in 2021 or in 2022. And it was a huge undertaking. Like I said, this was really led by community. This was not the politicos. It wasn't the politicians being like, yeah, we really need to do this. It was community showing up undeterred and showing up to vote and showing up to hold electeds accountable. And it's just amazing. I think we're on the cusp of really amazing things. Now the really hard work starts, right? So it's going to take us all again and community all again to make sure that our impacted families are at the center of the policy-making discussions and not an afterthought. They need to be at the center and forming it all the way through so that we're really building out a system that is by and for our families.
Laurie, I wanted to ask you to share some initial thoughts on what you've heard from the other panelists in terms of that long arc of what it takes to do this work over time. You know, what are the ingredients, if you will, that it takes to create these long-term wins, particularly for communities of color?
So I just want to say thank you to my sisters here on the panel. You guys are just so beautiful and strong and clear. And so I just want to say thank you, first of all, to all your hard work and being bare knuckle brawlers. But I guess for me, and just thinking about the long arc is, you know, we started a lot of this work on the shoulders of our own elders, right? There was a lot of people, you know, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s that were doing a lot of really important work. And I feel like it's important to acknowledge and to remember that there was a lot of work that happened in order for us to be able to have our own perspectives and outlooks on our political situations that we face today. And I think one of the things is, you know, really keeping track of and continuing to do that power analysis, because I think it really helps us to understand how we phase in our different strategic initiatives. So there was like one point in time when we wanted to really be allied and helpful to the immigrant community. And there was a whole bunch of us in a room talking about like, you know, how do we really strengthen, you know, this effort, you know. And one of the things was we recognized that if people were not earning, you know, close to a living wage, I know there's a big difference, whatever, but that wages was one of the battles that we needed to have first in order to then really make sure the work that we did with immigrant communities in alliance with immigrant communities, we would be able to sustain that battle once we were able to achieve it, right? And so I think it's important for us to continue, like I said, doing that power analysis, understanding like how we're phasing in these different strategic initiatives. And, you know, again, like some of these battles have been for years, right? Years and years and years. And I also just want to say a little bit about, I am really proud of the fact that a lot of the organizations here in New Mexico have really learned to deal with conflict, right? Both internally and externally. But it's something that I think we need to continue to work with our new up and coming folks. How do you really deal with conflict? And how do we really, because it's important in terms of picking the right battles, right? Because some of this stuff, I feel like we can get really caught up in this sort of liberation theology. And I love a good, you know, inspirational speech. There's nothing like it. It does fill your soul, but it's also like important to then say, well, then how do we really do that? If we were to really work at that, how do we phase that in to make sure that those sorts of policies, right? And people get like, oh, we don't want to talk about policies, right? But I just think it's really important because we need to continue picking fights and picking the right battles. And so I just think that is really a true learning experience that strengthens us. And so then when we're like to the political phase of things, like we're able to choose from our own memberships, our own community members, and they have had some level of vetting and some level of tempered capacity, right, to become good county commissioners, right, to become good legislators, right? And so, and knowing that it's going to be tough for them, like they're not always going to be our personal Santa Claus, right? And we have to be clear about that. And, you know, just the last point I'll make, and then I'll shush for a bit more, but we also, I feel like, need to be unabashedly political. Like, I think on some levels, like, it gets kind of like nerve-wracking, like, well, are you Democrat Junior or whatever, right? They want to sort of put you in this camp or that camp. But I think it's important in building power when you really look at those components that make up power and compare that against a list of powerlessness, right? We start to see that power needs to include all those things that are political. But we also need to recognize that many of our people, they have very mixed feelings, understandably, about politics, right? But I think if we disregard all that is political, then we really are just sort of playing games with ourselves and our communities. And so, you know, we still will need to continue to hold our own accountable. But I think there's ways to do that in that, you know, recognizing that if you're stepping up to be in that political situation, you're going to, you know, we all still have to push on ourselves and then also be understanding and mature about like, well, what's really possible at this point in time, because we just need to remember our elders, those generations that went before us, they never won everything in one fell swoop. It is very rare that that happened, you know, and even the early childhood education victory, and I'm so pleased about that. Thank you guys for doing all that work. That was many years in the making. Like, it didn't happen just because we all demanded it should happen, in, I guess, without the effort, without the voting, without the pushing on our legislators, and we had to go around them, and I'm proud of everybody's work on that.
Thank you, Laurie, for sharing those thoughts. I think what you bring up are a lot of important parts that over the long run will impact, right? Policies will impact the outcome of elections. And one of the things that you mentioned was something I was thinking about as you were talking is, how do we then, when we have wins, like we did on Tuesday around things like the constitutional amendment, when you do have electeds who won that may support abortion rights, healthcare, free education, how do we hold folks accountable, right? How do we hold the electeds accountable? And I know, Adriann, you hold a unique position on this panel in that you're a county commissioner as well as the leader of a nonprofit organization. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, how you work within community in that delicate balance of being held accountable and then also still being able to push forward on the values that will support New Mexico families. If you could share with us some thoughts on that.
Thank you. And thank you for this question. I feel I just had to, once again, Laurie always gives me chills. But her words are so needed for me right now, especially in this position you talk about where I'm and I'd like to say, I was alongside the women on this panel and with many listening in today. Is really where I learned, right, how important that year-round base building. You're going to hear it probably a million times today, right? But like Andrea said, we can't, when I was first entering the game, right, it was like this 50+1 helicopter in, convince all your people. And then I was not surprised why we had such low voter turnout, or why my own families and communities are like, I don't want to vote, or why the grassroots women of color that I was building with, the Young Women United at the time, were like, how much do we even want to get in this? Does our vote even matter, right? But being able to take those learnings and say, no, we're going to do this year round, and we're going to lead with our strengths, and we're going to lean on our partners for their strengths, and we're going to build true bases, and we're going to use the word power with our families, and we're going to say building power for strong families year round. And part of that is also that year-round part is about us all having meaningful ways to contribute. Before, I used to hear, and I'm sure people still say it, that, oh, New Mexicans are so complacent, or, oh, but people don't get out to vote, nobody cares. I actually know that when we put effort in, everybody is craving it. I mean, we have hundreds of people turning out to our stuff in McKinley and Doña Ana counties because they're craving it, they want it, but they don't want somebody coming in and just telling them vote this way, right? They want somebody, they want to understand, they want to be part of it, they want to help make the decisions. And that's when why we've been able to be so successful, even in our rural communities. If you think about how rural our communities are. And years ago, I would hear when we go to the legislature, so many of those legislators that represent rural communities would say, oh, my community is too Catholic, too rural, too indigenous, too Navajo. They don't support that. They don't. And no, we said, I know that to not be true. One, because my family lives all over this state, and I know that's not true for my own family, but we're going to do the work to prove it. And so we've been building that base. We've been building those own voices, not in a way of feel sorry for me, but I'm powerful because I can represent this. And so, yes, again, the base building year round. One time, I always have to share this story, especially thinking about elections. That I mentioned 50+1 strategy, and I'd always hear this, like, people look at what's the voting base and how do we get 50+1 to win. And I think it was Andrea before that also said it's not just the win. And I think that's what explains it all to me, because after we can say, oh, with the stacks were against us, or oh, but if we actually build the stacks to be for us, then we're not going and complaining about all the things against us. We're actually building what our families and communities were asking for in the beginning. And the one story I'm going to share is that we've been, when we only have had our C4 status for Forward Together Action for 2 years now. So before that, we were always doing our election strategies through a C3 lens, get out the vote, voter education. And so we do all the things, but always building year round. And we decided, if everybody prioritizes likely voters, which are the people that vote all the time, then let's just take the risk and prioritize unlikely voters. And so in both Doñana and McKinley counties, we prioritized unlikely voters. And we had great statistics, but the one that stood out the most, right, was that in McKinley County, and I want to be really clear, we had our McKinley County leaders doing phone banking. And I remember being like, Leroy, you got to talk faster, or like wanting to like plug in that way, but just take a step back. Nope, they know their own community. And sure enough, they knew when they picked up that phone that it was Leroy or Maria Burciaga or, whoever. They could recognize our community members, and they weren't hanging up. They weren't trying to get off the phone. They were staying on the phone, talking to them. And guess what? We only prioritize unlikely voters, and 80%, 80, of the unlikely voters that we reached out to turned out to vote that year, that election cycle. And so, we have to extend our ways. And I know all the other folks on this team have been for a long time, extending beyond that just win mentality and into like building the power we need for the long haul, the long arc, as this is described.
Thank you for sharing those stories, Adriann. I think that every time I hear you speak about that base building work that you all have done, and continuing to go back to ask folks to speak for themselves and to lift up what they need. And so to me, I've seen you do that and your organization do that. So thank you for sharing some of that. I wanted to, Andrea, ask if you could share, two of the things that that Laurie mentioned, right, was like picking the right fight, and then picking the right partners to engage in that fight, to create those wins. And so when you're looking at, some of the base building, building coalitions, doing statewide work, when you look at the constitutional amendment and things like that, what can you share with us in terms of what has worked for Olay and for the way that you all have taken a look at strategy and base building within your organization?
Yeah, there's not just one organization who could do this work. It has to be in coalition. It has to be something that we're building together. And it isn't enough to just say, well, we're all working toward the same thing, so let's all work together. I think that there has to be a shared goal, and there has to be a shared understanding of how we're going to get there. I oftentimes, make this joke that, we should just have one meeting once a week, 8 hours, and talk about all the things, because we all work together so often. I'm in coalition meetings all week long with the same folks. And sometimes you're like, are we meeting about voting rights today? No, we're meeting about, okay. We have to keep it really clear of what we're working on, because we all work together so much. That comes from years of trust building. There has to be trust in these coalitions that we're building. And there has to be this understanding that, that if we don't have this shared vision, then we're not going to make much movement. And when you have to make that decision for your organization to actually step away from a coalition, there's a lot of thought that has to go into that. There's a lot of conversation that has to go into that. When you are deciding to join a coalition, there's even more. There's really taking into consideration all of the stakeholders, all of the personalities. I really liked what Laurie said about like folks learning how to work with one another. And then also being really honest when we say, like, you know, I don't think that this partnership is going to work for us, or, you know, I don't think that this is something that we're going to move forward with. And when we can be honest about those things, then we're less likely to get in each other's way. You know, it really is about what's the forward movement. Oriana for years has talked about, like, resources are very few and far between in New Mexico. And so we have to work together in order to maximize that. And I agree wholeheartedly with that, because this is how we win. These wins that have been built over time in New Mexico, and it's taken years to get these wins, and it's always delicate and it's always precious. And so getting there really meant, like, we had to have faith in one another and faith in each other's work. And now to the point where it's, you know, being able to say, hey, we have extra literature, you know, that we leave on doors. Like, we have extra that we printed up. Does anyone else want it? And feeling okay about that, and not feeling this sense of being very territorial or being very, you know, like, that was ours or our name wasn't on it. I think it's being, you know, we partnered up with other organizations this year and sent out co-branded mailers, because it was about maximizing our reach and not just having the spotlight on our organization by ourselves. And you know, it's funny, I think that there was so much going on across the nation, and you know, we still don't know the outcome of what's going to happen in Congress, and all of the eyes are focused there. And meanwhile, like, New Mexico's like quietly building this like super state, right? This like super innovative state. And I kind of dig that. And I feel like it's the same for our work. You know, I'm really happy to be on this panel and talking about it. But when I was hearing all of the analysis by all these experts about the election and what the outcomes were going to be in New Mexico, it's so interesting to me that they discount the work that's being led by community, and that's oftentimes being led by women and non-binary folks of color. Like, I cannot stress that enough, that so much of the work that we do in coalition, you know, is with folks of color, with our accomplices, with the folks who, you know, have traditionally been at the lead and then got, you know, made space and said, no, I'm gonna follow the lead of community. I cannot stress enough how important that is to the big wins that we saw in New Mexico.
Thank you for saying that, Andrea. And I know I had a question that I wanted to put out there around, you know, what these wins mean in particular for people of color in New Mexico. And, you know, how do we sustain them? Because I think that then is like the next thing, right? So we've had this momentum, we've had these wins. We're also dealing with, you know, we're now a big target, right? And so we see a lot of influence from out of state coming in, a lot of money, outside money that we're having to deal with. You know, you talked about like limited resources, right, that we have to grapple with. So I actually wanted to ask Oriana if you could share some thoughts on that, right? Like, how do we sustain, and then what is sort of the strategy around dealing with the huge target that's on New Mexico and a lot of outside money that's coming into the state?
Yes, thanks, Alicia. Yes, I think we definitely see that every election cycle. We saw it this election cycle, especially as well, with the industries like gas and oil obviously have deep pockets. And so I won't discount our side either though, right? Like the advocacy sector in New Mexico and voters, we may not have as deep of pockets, but we do bring a lot of resources into the state to help fund our work. And I think most importantly, we have the people power, right? That all my other fellow panelists have been talking about. That is invaluable. And that is the hard work that all of us have been investing in that really bears out fruit, like we saw in this last election again as well. You can't, like if you're Chevron, you want to buy your votes, you can put down $100 per vote or whatever for voter outreach. And maybe we can't match that, but they can't match the 10, 20 years of relationship building and outreach building that we've been authentic conversations like Adriann talked about, right, that we're having with our communities and engaging them. And so, yes, I think the outside money and PACs and all of that, we're never gonna be on the same footing as the opposition, but I think that's not, they can't match our resources in terms of building power by and for a community and doing that year round, right? So I don't think you can put a price tag on that.
Can I jump in on that too?
Yes, Laurie, absolutely.
You know me. But I also think in terms of how do we sustain what we're building. The other thing I think is really important is that I feel like a lot of our organizations have really begun to understand those structural junctures that we face collectively. So like, for instance, the census, redistricting, like understanding that that was a very important piece of the work that we needed to really deal with and engage, right? And so, the tribes got really involved in redistricting, and, we found ourselves up against a lot of our, should be allies. They were kind of like, oh, dang, come on, tribes, you should just, it was sort of like, you guys should just accept that, we need to do it this way, and it's not going to really go that way. And, the tribes really stood firm, and I was really proud of the way that, all of the native redistricting efforts really kind of settled things. And, the result is we now have 3 congressional representatives that are on the more progressive side of things. And again, like, nobody really recognized that, but that was the work of all the different organizations, trying to get the census out. And I don't know how I ended up leaving like right about that time. But, just understanding that those are some of the processes that we really need to deal with. The other thing is to say that, I've been working a lot on water right now, and just, climate change, how that's going to affect our water over the next 50 years. And they're estimating like a 25% drop in our snowpack, our water, a lot of different things happening. And, the other half of that is like the infrastructure in which to manage water, the infrastructure in which to deal with water is missing, right? And like the state of New Mexico itself, like, again, like, on one hand, I've always been outside of the house and, can advocate from outside, but like having a glimpse at what's happening inside the house, so to speak, the state agencies, it's really kind of shocking to me, just how many of the agencies lack capacity. Like, I always thought it's just the Indian thing, like Indians don't have the capacity to do X, Y, or Z. But when you recognize like, wow, the state engineer under a less progressive administration lost like over 100 staff people, right? And when you count 100 staff people in the water state engineer's office, like, that's a lot of hours. That's a lot of non-enforcement. That's a lot of things, nobody's paying attention to. Nobody has the time to deal with those things. And suddenly I feel like, oh man, we got to help the state engineer's office, right? So in that way, like, yes, we need to be holding our folks accountable. But on the other hand, it is helpful to understand what it is that we're actually dealing with, within some of our own agencies, our own, because that belongs to us as the people, right? And so I do think that it's important for us in terms of that capacity building. We do need to continue to elevate. It's not just about, I don't think it ever was just about the voter, right? but about our communities being able to have that skills, those experiences, that understanding of how to manage those resources, whether that's dealing with the fires, dealing with the water, dealing with, quality of water, all these different things. Like, we really do need to be owning New Mexico in a way that these are our our leadership, right? And we need to make sure that we're also making, putting our own folks into those positions. So that way we have a strong understanding from inside the house to outside the house, right? And understanding if you go inside the house, things change, right? And that's a part of the maturity I think we really need to push on our new up and coming younger organizers to understand that New Mexico is very unique in that manner.
Laurie, thank you. I mean, as always, you glean wisdom that, I think we need to hear. And that leads me to one of the last questions that I wanted to ask you all, as you continue doing this work, when you think out, 5 to 10 years, what needs to happen that hasn't? And Laurie just shared some thoughts on what those things might be. But as we, get close to the hour here, I'd love to hear from the other panelists in terms of your thoughts around, what infrastructure is needed, what can community provide, what do elected officials need to do, what do we need to be thinking of and preparing for and building when we look out in the next 5 to 10 years?
I can start because I think some of the folks have more specific election stuff, but I would just say, like, I think some of my greatest memories, right, are when we decided we were going to center rural, indigenous, people of color communities in the fight to repeal that abortion ban, or in our fight for reproductive health, full spectrum, that the voices and experience that actually my coworker Jessica Lopez Collins said this one time, and I say it all the time, that our lived experiences are policy expertise. And so that wealth we bring about our own communities, our own fights, our own struggles, our own successes, the richness in our communities, that is the policy expertise. And then we need a little resources and support to make it go, right? But my proudest moments are that when we knew that centering the folks most impacted by reproductive oppression would get us the win, and how every time when somebody from that community, when Senator Munoz was yelling at Verna and Noreen Kelly in the hall saying that Navajos, telling 2 Navajo women that Navajos don't believe in abortion, they can't do that when our own people with our own stories are there. They get shut down and their lives can no longer continue on. And right now, our families are fighting for full spectrum reproductive health care and healthcare for all. We can go, because of that work, we can go beyond Roe in New Mexico. And because of that work, we're going to get healthcare for immigrant families and for all of us to be affordable in our state. And I'm just, base building year round. My last words.
Any other
I
thoughts
think
on?
New Mexico is not a poor state. We are not a poor state. We have tons of wealth from oil and gas, and I'm not just talking about the land grant permanent fund. Right now, state revenues in New Mexico are, they're high, and they keep climbing, and it comes from extraction on stolen land. And so in the next 5 to 10 years, the state needs to make big and bold investments in the people, and that comes, by way of schools, of early education, of healthcare, including behavioral healthcare, and also in infrastructure and building out infrastructure. And lots of folks have talked about broadband expansion, and there's so much to do, and New Mexico has the money to do it. And so decades of austerity politics and decades of austerity practitioners are what have kept us in last place. And this idea that a state that is a majority people of color state somehow deserves less than, in the next 5 to 10 years, there is an expectation that, New Mexico, and by New Mexico, I mean our state government is going to make those big investments in our community because they can do so. And so this era of being in last, that's over. It's over and done with.
Thank you for sharing that vision, Andrea. And I love the comment from Javier. Are we allowed to call you Dre Dog? In the comments.
I said,
So,
that's Dr. Dre.
Oh, Dr. Dre Dog. Okay. So we've got about 5 minutes. I wanted to share some resources and some upcoming webinars that Building Movement Project is going to be hosting, and then just hear some last thoughts from our panelists. I apologize that I wasn't able to open it up for Q&A from the audience. We didn't have a lot of chatter in the Q&A function, but lots of really great comments. And I'm wondering, Jasmine, now if you'd be willing to share the slide and drop into our chat the links. If you'll look at the chat, we've got some upcoming webinars that we're very excited about. On the 16th, Social Change Now. It's a book release and a talk from one of our BNP family. And then we've got on the 29th, Making and Taking Space, Preparing Organizations for Leadership Progressions. And these are featuring New Mexico leaders, and that will be moderated by our co-director, Sean Thomas Breitfeld. And then on the first, a movement infrastructure series, Building Capacity for Community-Based Nonprofits. So that's some of what we're continuing to do with Building Movement Project. And then I also want to just encourage folks to, if you haven't already responded to the Race to Lead survey that is still out in the field. This is a national survey. And it has, when we did it a couple of years ago, we've now produced the largest data set of race and leadership in the country. And so we'll continue with that. So racetolead.org. If you go there, you can respond to that survey. We've got just a couple minutes left, and I want to just open it up to our panelists to share any last words or thoughts with us. And again, thank you everyone who joined today, and thank you to our panelists again for taking the time out of what I know are very busy schedules. So any last thoughts in these couple last minutes we have?
Yeah, Alicia, I just 1000% to what Adriann and Andrea said. You know, we do have the expertise already living within our state and in our communities, and we just need to double down on that and invest in it, right? Like, we're working on what does the just transition piece of the climate bill look like for this session. So we're all heading to Hobbs tomorrow, our coalition, right? Because that's where the solutions are, from our leaders and our people that are on the front lines, not from like high-powered consultants from DC, right? Like, it's here. So I want to double down on that. And then also just like a practical type of systems change thing that a lot of us here are thinking about too is modernizing our legislature, because if our elected bodies are not representative of the experiences of New Mexicans, it's going to be that much harder, right, to pass laws and actually change the systems. And so modernizing our legislature so that folks can actually get paid, have professional help year-round, engage constituents at the level that we need to is going to be a priority for several of us, a lot of us here throughout the state.
Thank you, Oriana. I know, Adriann, it looked like you were about to say something, or no, Andrea, sorry. Anyone, any other thoughts you want to share before we?
Everybody always knows I could talk, but I wanted to give Laurie the last words.
And here I'm like, I talk too much already. I want to hear from everybody else. No, I just want to say thank you for hosting this conversation. I do think we need to have more of these conversations, whether that's amongst our own community folks. I also just want to note that it's important to always be seeped in reality and the existing conditions that we face, and, you know, do our best to understand what is oncoming. because I do think it was a little bit terrifying listening to the pundits and, you know, Trump trying to make his comeback and, you know, all that sort of nonsense. And I just keep thinking about like my own parents, and like they would be like, you don't have the guts to face reality. Like, what's wrong with you? You know, this is what we're dealing with. And, you know, all the denial, you know, and I wanted to tell Andrea, you should write a poem about arguing with the liar. Because I think that's really in a very real way, like that's some of the stuff that we are having to assert, and that we need to remain strong with our values, remain strong with the realities. And I also wanted just to give a little shout out to Frank Sanchez. I just saw he was on the one of our participants. He's one of who I considered like my leadership back in the day. And it's good to see you. And I think Miguel Acosta is the other one, but just to say shout out to all those guys too.
Thank you, Laurie, for always bringing us back to reality. I think that's a really beautiful message to end on in the midst of these times, right? And dealing with the pundits and so much misinformation out there. I'm thankful to all of you for keeping it real, for doing the work in community. Thank you again to everyone who joined our panel today. Building Movement Project thanks you. And please stay tuned. We'll send out the recording of today's webinar and have a post up on our website as well. So thank you, everyone. Go out, have a beautiful day, a safe weekend, many blessings. Thank you.